An alien woman showed her child my picture. He's the one, she said. He's your real father. Tarsus 7 never slept. It rusted, groaned, breathed recycled air, and buried the screams of 1,000 forgotten lives. Somewhere in the underlevels, a ration riot had broken out. Again, the overhead lights dimmed for power redirection. A klaxon sounded once, then cut off mid-howl like someone choking on a warning too late. Dr. Werner Avell didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. He sat in a heat-starved administrative wing surrounded by towers of unscanned records and flickering data slabs. The office had once been part of the refugee tribunal complex. Now it was where they sent people to be forgotten, him included. He used to write laws. Now he filed the names of those the laws forgot. The air stank of sweat, damp insulation, and the metallic tang of processed oxygen. His fingertips were stained with decades of ink and regret. Werner scrolled past another denied asylum request, a line blinking, case closed, cultural instability. The same phrase that had haunted him for 10 years. She looked straight at the monitor, not at the judges, not at the translator, at me. Please don't let protocol decide my daughter's fate. He had. A soft, wet slap of bare feet on cold metal pulled him from the memory. Then stillness. He looked up. A child stood in the doorway, still as breath, watching him with large dark eyes that shimmered violet under the dying fluorescence. She looked like a question no one wanted to ask. Her skin was a soft, dusky blue, marbled with faint pale scarring, delicate, branching, and oddly symmetrical. Not random, not natural. Werner's eyes lingered. Medical scars disguised as birth patterns. Old. Possibly classified. She wore an oversized tunic that sagged around her thin shoulders, soaked at the hem. Her black hair hung long, wet from the condensation that dripped constantly from the ceiling vents. She couldn't have been more than 5. She gripped a folded square of paper in both hands. My mom said you're my real father, she said quietly. Her voice was soft, precise, not shy, measured. Werner froze. His stomach tightened, and his first instinct was denial. I think there's been a mistake, he said, voice rough from disuse. She didn't react. She walked forward on silent feet and held out the folded page. He took it with numb fingers, an ID scan, faded, 10 years old. His face stared back at him, sharp and clean-shaven, still believing in process, still thinking language could save people. He hadn't seen that face in years. She watched him like a scientist watching for a reaction, like she'd already calculated the odds of him running or folding. Who? He started, but the words vanished as another figure appeared in the doorway. A woman. She was wrapped in a blanket that had once been military issue, now stained and fraying. Her black hair fell in tangled ropes down her back, slick with sweat and station dust. Her face was gaunt, the angles of her jaw and cheekbones too sharp, but her eyes, fierce, defensive, tired, were unmistakable. Elira, Werner whispered, barely audible. She didn't smile. She didn't move. He rose slowly from his seat, heart thrumming in his chest. The last time he'd seen her, she was behind a reinforced screen, her voice half drowned by translation lag and tribunal indifference. She nodded once. You remember? I remember everything, he said. She looked at the child, then back at him. She needed a story, one that gave her hope, a name, a face. I gave her yours. He stared at the girl again. Her eyes were calm, too calm, like she'd been forced to learn silence early. She's not mine, he said quietly, but it didn't come out as a denial, more like a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. No, Elira said, but she might as well be. I had to give her something better than truth. She's beautiful, Werner said and meant it. They called me broken, Elira said, voice flat. I wasn't. I just didn't know their words for pain yet. The girl, leery, he assumed, sat cross-legged on the cold floor without invitation, as if she'd done this before, as if sitting still was the safest way to not be noticed. They watch us, she said. The men with blinking coats. Werner lowered himself slowly, crouching to her level. What's your name? Leary. He nodded. That's a strong name. She tilted her head. You have tired eyes. A burst of static cut through the station's intercom system. A distorted announcement echoed overhead. Location check for Deck S ring. Structural instability warning. Sector-wide patrols engaged. Werner glanced at the ceiling, heart racing now for a different reason. He took off his coat, plain gray, standard issue, and gently placed it around Leary's small shoulders. She didn't flinch. She leaned into it. From the doorway, Alira's voice broke the silence, softer than before, and far more dangerous. Will you break the law for us now? The door to Werner's quarters slid open with a sluggish sigh, its motor barely functioning after years of deferred maintenance. The space beyond was modest, narrow, dim, and barely warmer than the corridors. But it was private, and it was safe for now. He stepped aside to let them in. Elira hesitated at the threshold. Her body moved like it was still waiting for a trap door to swing open beneath her. Leary didn't wait. She slipped past both adults, her small feet padding softly across the cold floor. She moved with a strange confidence, like someone who'd learned that hesitation only made you visible. Werner watched them, uneasy and oddly breathless. He hadn't shared this room with anyone in years, not even briefly, not even for warmth. Elira finally entered, her eyes scanning the interior in a quick, trained sweep. Bed, heating unit, food storage, vents. She didn't ask questions. She just took mental inventory like survival demanded it. Werner closed the door and reset the internal lock. His hands trembled slightly. You can stay the night, he said, voice low. I'll take the floor. Elira didn't answer. She dropped the fraying thermal blanket onto a chair and crouched beside her daughter. Leary was already examining the edge of the thin sleeping mat with the intense focus only a child or a survivor could give to something soft. I'll make something hot, Werner added, turning toward the heating unit. You both look like you haven't eaten in days. Still no response. He didn't press. He filled a thermal pot with ration broth, dropped in 2 nutrient blocks, and let the smell of fake meat and rehydrated vegetables fill the room. It was nothing, but it was hot, and it was his. Behind him, Leary sat cross-legged on the mat, drawing invisible lines on the floor with one finger. Her tunic had dried unevenly, and now clung to her sides. She looked impossibly small in the soft yellow light. Elira sat a full meter away from her, back to the wall, eyes half-lidded but never closed. When the soup was ready, Werner poured it into 2 metal bowls and placed them on the floor. Eat, he said gently. Please. Elira didn't move, but Leary did. She crawled forward, her hands careful not to make noise, and reached for the bowl. She held it in both hands, reverent. Steam rose between her face and the broth, and she closed her eyes like it was sunlight. Then she looked up. It's okay, Mama, she whispered. I'll say thank you for both of us. Werner sank to his knees, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands. That's very brave of you, he said. He handed her a spoon. Elira's eyes flicked between them. Something shifted in her expression. Nothing dramatic, just a tiny crack in the hardened mask she wore. She didn't eat, but she stopped keeping her hands so tightly clenched. Leary slurped her soup in small, careful mouthfuls. Halfway through the bowl, her hands began to shake. She tried to hide it. She failed. A tiny sob hiccuped out of her throat before she could stop it. Werner reached for her, then stopped. He didn't touch her. He just stayed close. Elira turned away, face in her hands, silent. I can get more, Werner said quietly. Leary shook her head. It's just hot. It's good. He nodded, even though her voice cracked with every word. Afterwards, he offered a second blanket and stepped aside as Elira wrapped it around her daughter and lay beside her on the mat. She didn't face him, but she didn't shut him out either. He sat by the terminal, pretending to work, pretending not to watch them breathe. Minutes passed, then an hour. The lights dimmed on automatic cycle, casting the room in a soft, golden glow. Leary was the first to sleep, her arm draped across her mother's ribs, tiny fingers twitching with whatever dreams 5-year-olds had after surviving too much. Elira remained still. Then, without warning, she spoke. Her voice was a dry whisper, almost a scrape. You followed orders, she said. That's what they all said. You were the only one who looked sorry about it. Werner didn't move. I was sorry. You didn't fight for us. No, he admitted. I didn't. Silence, then softer. You had the right voice. We remembered it. He stared at the glow of the screen, not reading a word. Why now, he asked. Why come back? A long pause, then, because she started drawing your face. Before I ever showed it to her. The breath caught in his lungs. He turned slowly to look at them. Alira met his gaze, her own unreadable in the dark. I didn't know what it meant, she said, but I knew she needed you. Another alarm echoed faintly through the station's steel bones. Distant, not urgent. Just a reminder. The world outside still didn't care, but inside that narrow room, the air was warmer, thicker with something unnamed. Werner didn't sleep. He watched them, protected them, and somewhere deep beneath the quiet hum of old regret, something alive began to stir. A purpose, a pulse, and he knew. This was the first night in years he didn't feel alone. Werner didn't sleep. He sat upright on the edge of his desk, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the vague shapes under the blanket across the room. The glow strips had dimmed to low-cycle amber, painting Alira's face in soft light. Her eyes were closed, but he knew she wasn't sleeping either. Leary had curled into her mother's chest hours ago, small limbs tucked like she was trying to disappear. Her breathing had steadied, but even in sleep, her fingers twitched, always reaching. Time passed like vapor, slow, clinging, heavy with everything unsaid. Werner didn't know what time it was when Alira finally spoke. She hums in her sleep when she feels safe, she said, voice barely above a breath. He looked up, startled by the softness. She wasn't looking at him, still faced the wall, but her voice carried. It carried weight. She hasn't hummed in a long time. He didn't know what to say. Every phrase that came to mind felt inadequate, too neat for the quiet wreckage between them. I hear her, he said finally. A pause, then she started drawing people before she could speak. Not stick figures, faces, always the same one, always yours. Werner swallowed hard. His voice faltered. She's never even seen me. Alira nodded slightly, not with her eyes. They fell into silence again, but it was different now, less brittle. Something had cracked open, and the air inside the room shifted with it. Werner stood slowly, stretching stiff limbs, and walked to the corner where his old kettle sat. He poured recycled water into a cup and handed it to her without a word. She took it. Their fingers brushed. Just for a second, she flinched, but only slightly. And then she didn't let go. The warmth of the metal cup passed between their hands like a small transfer of trust. Then she took it fully and sipped, her lips trembling just once. They kept us in pods, she said, after the tribunal. I was told we'd be transported, but it wasn't a ship. It was an intake block. Her voice was flat, the words spoken like reciting a document too many times. They called it a reorientation center. Every few weeks they would inject us with inhibitors. Memory blocks, they said, to help us adapt. But they weren't to help. Werner felt something turn in his stomach. Why didn't anyone? Because we didn't exist anymore, she interrupted. Because no one was watching. He sat across from her, not close, but not distant either. She didn't look up. She stared at the floor, one hand resting on Larry's back. I escaped with her when she was still bleeding from her first growth markers. She was 3 days old. I wrapped her in sensor cloth and crawled out through the wastewater shafts. The image struck him like a physical blow. A newborn, wet and cold and silent, pressed against skin in a place where light didn't reach. Alira lifted her gaze just for a second and met his eyes. I killed someone to get out, she said. I didn't know how, but I did. Werner didn't flinch. You did what you had to. She looked surprised, like she'd expected condemnation, like that was what she'd prepared for. They called you a paperman, she said after a long silence. All law, all caution. But when I saw you in that tribunal chamber, your hands were shaking. He didn't deny it. They shook because I knew what I was doing, and I did it anyway. Leary stirred in her sleep, murmuring something in her native tongue. Alira immediately soothed her, brushing her forehead, whispering a half-sung cadence that might have been a lullaby or a prayer. When Leary settled, Alira looked up again. I don't trust humans, she said. Not really, but I trust the way she looks at you. Werner's voice caught. She shouldn't. Elira tilted her head. Why not? He exhaled slowly. Because I didn't stop them. I didn't speak up. I read your file, saw your scan, and let them mark you defective. I knew better, and I stayed quiet. And now, she asked not gently. Now, he said, I can't fix what's behind us. But maybe I can stop one more future from breaking. For the first time, Elira didn't look like she was calculating how to leave. She looked tired, but in a way that resembled rest, not survival. Leary rolled over, now half buried in the blankets. She reached out blindly and touched Werner's knee. She didn't wake, just held on. Elira watched that small hand, her face unreadable. She doesn't need a savior, she said. She needs someone who won't vanish. I won't, he said. Don't say that unless it's true. I've already said nothing for too long. It's time I mean something. The low hum of Tarsus 7 groaned through the walls. Metal fatigue, duct vibration, distant footsteps of patrol units. But inside this small square of quiet, something human had taken root. Elira leaned back against the wall, eyes closed. And then, softer than anything he'd heard her say yet, sleep, Werner. I'll keep watch for a while. The silence inside Werner's quarters wasn't empty. It was full of breath, the low hum of recycled air, the faint rustle of blankets. Full of things left unsaid. Elira had fallen asleep first. That surprised him. She lay on her side now, her back to the door, arms curved protectively around Leary's small body. Her long black hair had dried in tangled ribbons across the blanket, catching the light with a quiet sheen. One hand was open near her daughter's ribs, resting, not clutching. For the first time since she arrived, she wasn't braced for flight. Werner hadn't meant to fall asleep, but sometime between her last whispered word and the warming of the overhead strips, he had. Now he sat cross-legged across from them, arms around his knees, watching the way Leary breathed. She looked even smaller in the morning light. Her skin was the same pale indigo as her mother's, but her facial structure, cheekbones, jawline, had something unfamiliar, something gentler, human maybe, or maybe just hers. She didn't stir when the shift change alarm groaned through the station's bones. She just pressed her face deeper into Elira's shoulder and sighed. Werner didn't move. He didn't want to. For the first time in years, he felt as though his presence mattered. Elira stirred moments later. She blinked, adjusted to the light, then met his gaze without flinching. There was something different in her eyes now. Still tired, still guarded, but no longer accusing. I didn't mean to sleep, she said. You needed to, Werner answered. She nodded, sat up slowly, looked around the room like she had to reorient herself to stillness. Werner stood and poured 2 cups of synthcaf. He handed her one, and this time her fingers didn't flinch when they brushed his. Thank you, she said. It wasn't small. Coming from her, it was monumental. They sat quietly for a while, the weight of unspoken things stretching thin between them. Finally, Elira broke it. You said you knew everything. About me. From the tribunal records, Werner nodded. As much as they allowed me to read, she tilted her head. Then you don't know everything. He waited. She sipped her drink, eyes on the rim of the cup. I was born on a moon called Ureth 3. My people kept our memory in skin. Our bloodlines were written in tattoos, history, inheritance, even grief. When a child was born, they were inked in the old way, just one mark. The rest came with life. She held out her arm and rolled up the sleeve. Faded white etchings, almost invisible against her dusky skin, wrapped around her forearm in a delicate spiral. They sterilized most of us, she said, matter of fact. Said our genetics were unstable, that our memory tattoos indicated tribalist bias. Too emotional, too attached to old structures. Werner's hands clenched around his cup. That wasn't in the reports. Of course not. That part happened after the verdicts. In the dark places, the facilities that don't get audits. I survived because I stopped speaking their language. I became what they thought I was, silent, compliant, broken. Her voice didn't crack, but her hand tightened in her lap. I only spoke again when I heard your voice. Werner's breath caught. He remembered that recording, his final words at her tribunal, a question about translation delay, a note of concern, quickly buried. He hadn't known anyone was listening. She heard it too, Elira added. Leery, not with her ears, with whatever part of her survived the first year. He looked toward the child again. Leery was awake now, eyes half-lidded, listening without moving. I wasn't her first, Elira said suddenly. He turned sharply. She was conceived in that place. I don't know from whom. One of the medical staff, maybe. A test subject. I stopped counting what they took. Werner felt like the floor beneath him had dropped away. I thought she wouldn't survive, Elira continued. But she did, quietly, deliberately. And when we escaped, she never cried. Not once. Leery sat up then, slowly. Her hair spilled over her face, but she brushed it back calmly. I dreamt of you again, she said to Werner. You were carrying fire in your coat. His throat tightened. What kind of fire, he asked gently. The kind that doesn't burn. The kind that makes cold things stop being scared. Elira looked at her daughter like she was seeing her for the first time again. She doesn't speak like others, she said. It's not affectation. She sees things differently. Werner nodded. Some voices aren't taught. They're remembered. They spent the morning together in that fragile quiet, eating a simple meal, repairing a tear in the blanket, brushing out Leary's hair. No questions about what came next. Just movement. Small human movements that felt like the beginning of something lasting. And then as Leery curled up again beside the heating duct, Elira sat beside Werner on the floor. Not too close. Not far. She looked at him and said, You didn't ask me why I showed her your picture. I figured the answer was the same as mine, he replied. What's that? She needed to believe there was someone out there who wouldn't leave. A pause. And maybe, he added, so did you. Elira didn't answer, but she didn't argue. Instead, she let her head rest lightly against his shoulder. Just for a moment. It wasn't surrender. It was memory being rewritten. Gently, together. The day broke quietly, but the tension came in with the air system's shift cycle. Werner could feel it in his chest. Thin, metallic, heavier than usual. There had been talk of another lockdown sweep. The outer sectors were already under restricted movement. He tried not to let it show. Leery was still asleep, curled in a nest of blankets beside the wall heater. Her breath was soft even. Elira stood by the door, her back straight, arms folded, watching the corridor's low-res camera feed from the screen above. 2 patrols in the last hour, she murmured. Both in this ring. Werner nodded. They're closing in. S-ring's going to be next. He didn't have to say why that mattered. Elira's shoulders tensed slightly. They both knew what happened when undocumented civilians were found outside designated sectors. Detainment, genetic scans, protocols written by people who never set foot in places like this. I can move you both into the old tribunal archive, Werner said. It's buried. No cams, no foot traffic. I used to go there to disappear. Elira turned toward him. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice was calm. Disappear. That's a word you know well. The words weren't meant as a wound, but they landed like one anyway. I hid there, he admitted, because facing what I'd done felt worse than being forgotten. A moment passed, then she said, We'll go. He packed quickly, rations, heat blankets, old IDs, and led them down a maintenance corridor 2 levels below. The air grew colder the deeper they went. The hum of the station faded into hollow silence. The archive chamber hadn't been touched in years. Dust coated the floor in uneven patterns. Rows of broken shelves leaned like rotting teeth, and the far wall bore a handprint made of something too faded to name. But it was dry, and it locked from the inside. Leery clung to Elira's coat but didn't make a sound. She looked around the dark space like she was memorizing exits. It's not much, Werner said, but no one will find you here. It's enough, Elira said. They settled in. Later, Werner lit a hand lantern and found a battered old children's data book among the discarded crates. He ran his thumb along the cracked spine, hesitant. Would she want? He asked. She'll listen, Elira replied. So he read. Leery lay curled in her mother's lap, silent, eyes wide. The words weren't special, just an old tale about a planet that grew flowers from rust. but she listened like it mattered. Halfway through, she crawled from Alira's arms into his lap. Didn't ask, didn't look up. She just nestled in, small and warm and steady. He kept reading. When the story ended, Alira was sitting closer. Not quite beside him, but not far. She's never done that before, she said. Maybe she remembers the voice, he said quietly. Alira looked at him for a long time. Then, "You're not what I thought." He lowered the book. "What did you think I was?" "A man who wanted to feel righteous without getting his hands dirty. And now? Now I think your hands were already dirty, and you hated yourself for it." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence stretched between them again, but it wasn't empty this time. "She wasn't supposed to survive," Alira said. Her voice trembled. "I didn't name her for the first 6 days. I was sure she would die in the vents. She didn't make a sound, just watched me with those eyes like she knew." Werner didn't speak. He reached out and gently, slowly, placed his hand over hers. She flinched, then breathed. Her fingers didn't pull away. "You don't owe us anything," she whispered. "I know. You could walk away. I won't." She turned her hand over and laced her fingers with his. Something in the room shifted. The distance that had been carefully maintained for days, emotional, physical, unspoken, collapsed. Leary stirred in his lap but didn't wake. Her small hand tugged at his shirt, and Werner adjusted his arm around her, holding her gently but securely. "I spent 10 years convincing myself I couldn't feel anything anymore," he said. "That silence was safer." "And now?" Alira asked, her voice barely audible. He looked at her. "Now I'm terrified," he said. She leaned closer, slowly, carefully. There was no rush, no dramatic pull, just warmth, shared breath. The kind of quiet that existed only between two people who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Her forehead touched his. She didn't kiss him, not yet, but her voice was against his lips when she said, "Then stay terrified. Just don't leave." He closed his eyes and held on. And the scream echoed through the ventilation shaft like a warning from another world, sharp, animal, and real. Werner jolted awake, his body tense before his mind caught up. He was already moving when the second sound came, a heavy metallic thud, followed by the mechanical drone of patrol boots against steel. Across the room, Alira had dropped into a crouch, pulling Leary to her chest with fluid, practiced motion. Her hand clamped gently over the girl's mouth, not out of fear, but precision. She didn't need to tell her daughter to stay quiet. Leary didn't cry. She just blinked up at her mother with wide, steady eyes. Werner crept to the hatch and pressed his ear against the seam. A burst of static filtered through the wall. "Level S breach confirmed. Genetic irregularity alert issued. Begin target sweep. Non-compliant civilians will be restrained." His heart sank. They weren't looking for vague suspects anymore. They had Leary's trace. "They know," he said, turning back. Alira's face didn't change. "Then we run." Werner crossed to the storage crate and yanked it open, fingers moving fast. Rations, ID falsifiers, a half-charged energy cell, the emergency beacon he'd rebuilt from scrap. He slung the satchel over his shoulder and reached for Leary's travel wrap. "I'll draw them off," he said, tightening the straps. "No!" Alira snapped, her voice sharp. "They'll kill you." He looked her in the eye. "They'll kill her." She stood. "You're not going alone. You're not dying in front of your daughter." They stared at each other in a silence thicker than fear. "She needs one of us to survive," he said, "and she needs you more than she needs me." Leary looked between them, unblinking. Then she stepped forward, her tiny hand gripping Werner's coat. "You said you'd stay," she whispered. His voice cracked. "I will, I promise. But first, I have to keep you safe." She pressed her palm to his chest. "You carry warm fire." Werner nodded. "I'll bring it back to you." He turned to Alira. She was already unfastening her cloak, wrapping Leary inside it with care. Her fingers trembled just once. Then she stepped toward Werner and kissed him. It wasn't soft. It wasn't shy. It was a choice made in full knowledge of what it might cost. Her hands cupped his jaw. Her breath trembled as it passed his lips. And when she broke away, she didn't apologize for it. "I'll remember that," she said. even if I have to forget everything else." Then she was gone, Leary wrapped tight to her chest, disappearing into the black tunnel mouth Werner had unlocked 2 days before. Werner turned back toward the hatch. The first flash of a drone scanner beam licked under the door. He ran. The chase was chaos. He triggered maintenance alarms, rerouted emergency bulkheads, and baited patrols into dead sectors. He set fire to a coolant line near the power grid, knowing the heat signature would confuse their tracking system. He left false trails, tossed his own decoy ID into a data core, and doubled back to throw off the AI handlers. Still, they stayed close. He ducked into a collapsed processing chamber, ribs burning, coat scorched. Smoke clung to him like a second skin. He could barely see, but he was still breathing. He crawled to the wall terminal and hacked in. A lockdown override, one he hadn't used in years. He opened a sealed cargo tube, one he'd shown Alira 3 nights ago, tracing the rodent dust with his fingertip. She would be near it now. If she was alive, he could only give her a window. That would have to be enough. He keyed in the heat vent override and hit confirm. The world erupted in white light and pressure. He woke to silence. Not peace, just absence. His ears rang. His skin stung. He was bleeding from somewhere, but he was still alive. Smoke wafted through the corridor like memory. He pulled himself to his feet, coughing, and stumbled toward the nearest stairwell. His vision blurred. His legs buckled more than once. And then, his comm cracked. Faint, static-laced, but unmistakable. "Werner," Alira's voice rasped. "We're clear." His knees hit the floor. She was alive. He laughed, wild, broken, half sob, half joy. "I told you," he whispered. "I promised." They found each other again an hour later in a decompression chamber on the edge of the abandoned shipping dock. Leary ran to him before he could stand. She wrapped her arms around his leg and pressed her face into his side. He dropped to his knees and held her. Alira was limping, ash on her cheek, one arm cradling a cracked rib, but her eyes were whole. She crossed to him without hesitation. "I thought you were gone," she said, voice low. "I was close." She touched the side of his face, carefully, reverently. "You came back." "I said I would." She didn't speak again. She just leaned forward and rested her forehead against his, her breath warm, steady. "You're ours now," she whispered. He nodded. "I always was." The shuttle broke through the last of Tarsus 7's upper drift clouds, its thrusters groaning as ancient metal struggled against gravity. For a long time there was only noise. Engines, wind shear, Werner's voice murmuring status checks into a cracked console. Then, stillness, orbit, and beyond the cracked viewplate, stars stretched out like a map with no borders. In the passenger cradle, Leary blinked against the brightness. Her small fingers pressed against the frost-lined glass, leaving behind the first warm marks in hours. "We're flying," she said. Werner glanced back. "We are." Alira sat beside her, wrapped in a salvaged flight blanket. Her arm brushed his when she leaned in to tighten the child's harness. Her skin was marked with soot and a fresh bandage at her shoulder, but her voice was calm. "Where are we headed?" she asked. "Far," Werner replied. "Past mapped lanes. There's a pre-approved terraformer colony still in Phase 1. Light soil, breathable atmosphere, poor infrastructure. They need hands. No questions asked." "Sounds perfect." She leaned her head briefly on his shoulder. Leary's voice piped up again, soft. "Does the new place have a sky?" "It does," Werner said, "and it's real." They arrived 4 standard weeks later. The outpost had no proper name, just a designation code and an orbital relay. But the land was red gold under a lavender sky, and the winds carried the clean, dry scent of new life. Their shelter was simple: modular walls, insulated corners, a solar panel array patched together from Werner's salvage. Alira worked the soil pods with the ease of someone who knew how to coax hope from dead ground. Leary helped, carrying handfuls of seed-rich dust from the cart to the plot, barefoot and careful. Every morning, Werner ran diagnostics on the old atmospheric converters, replacing filters, soldering circuits. But each day, he returned to find something small that hadn't been there before. A new green leaf poking through dirt, Leary's drawing scrawled in chalk on the outer wall, Alira's coat hanging next to his by the door. Home wasn't loud. It never had been, but it was steady. One night, as the red moon rose, Alira returned from the outer fields holding a flat, circular stone. She set it on the table and opened a cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside, a memory blade and a vial of dark violet ink. She met Werner's eyes without speaking. He understood. She sat down, rolled up her sleeve, and began to carve. Deliberate, ceremonial. The pattern traced across her upper arm, elegant and slow, her breath steady with each movement. When she finished, she turned the blade and offered it to him. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he answered, but he took it anyway. She guided his hand, not over her skin, but over hers together, his human hands trembling, her alien markings firm beneath. "What does it say?" he asked quietly. "That you stayed," she said, "that you burned the rules for something warmer." Leary watched from the doorway, her eyes wide, a blanket over her shoulders. "Will I have one someday?" she asked. Alira smiled. "Yes, when you choose what story to keep." Time passed. Leary grew. Her drawings became sharper, full of stars and roots and hands holding hands. She asked fewer questions about what came before. She lived forward. One morning, Werner stepped outside and found her crouched in the dirt, staring at a green sprout that had pushed through the soil overnight. "It wasn't one we planted," she said. "It came on its own." He knelt beside her. "That's how some lives start. Unexpected, but just as real." She looked up at him. "Will it be strong? If we care for it." Behind them, Alira stood at the threshold, arms crossed, watching them in the early light. Her face was no longer guarded. She stepped forward and joined them, wrapping her arms gently around both. The wind shifted, warmer now, carrying the scent of soil and fire. That evening, Werner sat alone by the converter tower, watching the red moon rise again. He thought of Tarsus, the flickering lights, the drone calls, the endless names he filed, each one forgotten. And he thought of Alira's breath on his neck, of Leary's hand in his, of roots. A quiet footstep approached. He didn't need to turn. "You built something," Alira said. "So did you." She knelt beside him, her hand slid into his. "I used to think survival was the end," she said. "And now? Now I think it's the beginning." He kissed her then, soft, sure, complete. Not as a question, not as escape, but as an answer. Much later, as Leary slept beneath a ceiling she no longer feared would fall, Werner etched 3 small lines on a scrap of alloy, dull but enduring. No names, just 3 shapes: a flame, a flower, a hand. Then he placed it on the edge of the plot, where the green thing grew, unplanted but not unclaimed, and he whispered, for no one but himself, "We made this." And this time, there was no silence afterward, only breath, only warmth, only home. The sun was gentle that morning. A soft gold filtered through the canopy mesh of the outer biodome. It cast long shadows across the garden rows, warming the rich red soil and the bare backs of Werner's hands as he worked. Sleeves rolled past his elbows. He moved slowly, not from fatigue, but because he could. The urgency was gone. The fear was gone. He planted with his fingers. No gloves today, just skin to earth, seed to furrow. Behind him, Leary laughed, not softly, not like a survivor testing the air, a full, bell-clear sound. She darted between the low crop markers and bare feet, her hair tied with a strip of blue cloth Alira had stitched from an old solar wrap. She carried a stick and a wooden ring, her latest invention, a game that had no rules, only motion. "Careful," he called. "That's where the water roots are still setting." "I'm dancing for them," she said, twirling, arms wide. "It makes them brave." Werner smiled, resting on his heels. "Then carry on." The door to the living module slid open behind them, with a smooth, sand-hiss sound. Alira stepped out, a steaming cup in each hand. Her tunic was faded, the seams hand-mended, but she wore it like silk. The morning light painted her in soft edges, blue-toned skin catching warmth like brushed stone, her long hair woven loosely over one shoulder. She crossed to Werner first, offering him a cup. "Brewed it the way you like. Bitter enough to regret." He took it, smirking. "You've been watching me." I've been memorizing you. She sat beside him, not touching yet, but close. Her leg brushed his. She sipped her own drink, eyes following Leary's spirals across the field. She sings to the plants now, Alira said. It's working. Werner nodded. She stopped checking the door locks 2 nights ago. Silence, but not emptiness. Only quiet proof of healing. Elira reached into her belt pouch and unfolded a small cloth packet. Inside, a silver needle, a tiny roll of skin flecks, and a fresh vial of ink. She looked at him. I want to add a new line today. Werner set his cup down. Now? I want to mark the first morning that started without memory of pain. She rolled up her sleeve, bearing the spirals that already told their story. Escape, survival, love chosen, not owed. She pressed the needle into her skin with care and precision. Will you say it? She asked. He swallowed. Say what? What I should write. He hesitated, then looked out over the garden, over Leary's bounding shadow and the rising blue-green of the leaves she'd named. He said, let it say she stayed. Elira looked at him and smiled, not with sadness, not with doubt, just full, open warmth. She did, she said. Then she inked it. Later they ate outside, on cloth spread over the packed dirt, warmed by the sun and dotted with the spoils of their little harvest. Roasted root slices, grain loaves, boiled greens. Leary insisted on arranging the plates. She took Werner's hand, pressed a flower into his palm and whispered, this one grew faster because you told it you believed in it. He said nothing, just kissed her hair. Elira leaned back on her elbows, watching them. She's you in the ways that matter. She's you in the ways that saved her. They stayed there for a long time. No one checked the sky. No one listened for drones. That night, Leary slept early. The stars above were scattered like paint, flickering gently through the dome's transparent shell. Werner and Alira lay together on the small platform bed they'd pushed near the open hatch, so they could feel the night. Alira lay on her side, tracing the new ink along her arm with one finger. Werner watched her in silence, hand resting against her waist. She stayed, she repeated. I never thought those words could belong to me. They always did, he said. You just needed time to believe them. A breeze drifted through the cracked hatch, carrying the scent of new growth, warm stone, and the faint sweetness of Leary's mint flowers from the outer plot. Alira shifted closer, her forehead resting lightly against his. Their breaths synced without effort. You're not afraid anymore, she said. He thought about it. No, he answered. I'm not afraid of staying. Then you're home. He kissed her slowly, soft, warm, without urgency, just presence. And under a sky they didn't have to run from, with a child they had saved and a world they had planted. Werner Avil, the quiet man who once filed forgotten names, held the two beings who had rewritten his. They were not running, they were not hiding, they were simply alive, together.